Hello, PyOhioans. I'm James Walters, your Who's Your Neighbor, and today I'm going to take you on a web scraping crash course with Python and Scrapy. Let's get started. First of all, let's begin by asking an obvious question. What is web scraping? Web scraping is extracting data directly from HTML pages. Many times, if you're consuming a data source on the internet, there's a JSON API available to you. And these are nice because it's easy to tailor your requests to narrow the data you get back, and it comes to you as JSON, a data format that's pretty easy to import into your program so you can do things with it. However, there's a lot of data out on the web that isn't available through a JSON API, but it is available on web pages. The challenge here is you have to pull that data out of the HTML pages that it's in. That's what web scraping is. And even though it takes some extra work, the data that it unlocks for you is well worth it. So that's what web scraping is, but what is Scrapy and why should you use it to write your web scraper? Scrapy is a framework for making web scrapers. You can think of it as the Django of web scraping. It's this framework that comes with all these batteries included to help you scrape. And that's important because it won't be long if you're doing a web scraping project of any substantial size before you start running into pain points. The first web scraping project I ever made is still in use today, but I just threw it together with the requests library and Beautiful Soup. Those are great tools, but as my project got bigger, I started running into some common issues with web scraping, and these were a lot more trouble to fix than they would have been with Scrapy. Issues like messing with user agents, creating JSON out of the results and sending an email, adding timeouts and waits for requests, making requests asynchronously. All of these things come in the box for you with Scrapy. So that's why I recommend using it for building your web scraper. So, now that we've explained what web scraping is and what Scrapy is and why you should use it, let's build a web scraper. For our example, we're going to scrape events from the event calendar on New York Public Library's website. This is a great idea. Your local library probably puts on a lot of free events that you're interested in, and this is a great way to keep track of those events and see what's coming up. And this is a great case for a web scraper, because this information, while publicly available on the web, isn't available to us via an API. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to our library website, nypl.org, and on the site menu, we'll click on Events. Then we'll scroll to our event calendar link. And then on this page, we'll filter down to the events we're interested in. So that'll be just the adult events, and let's say we live in Manhattan, so we'll only look at things in that borough. And as for what to look for, something that a lot of libraries do is film screenings of culturally or intellectually valuable films. This is a great way to see an edifying film for free, so we'll look at those. And looking at our results, looks like we've got over 130 films that are going to be aired in my area. This is some awesome information, but now we've got to figure out how to scrape this. So let's turn over to the code editor. So I've got a brand new folder here for our project, and I've created a virtual environment, and I've pip installed Scrapy. So the first thing that we'll want to do after that is run a command called scrapy start project. This is going to scaffold out our entire project for us, and we'll call our project event extractor. And over here you'll see that that has created a project folder with all of this stuff in it. We're not going to talk about any of that today. We're going to try and keep our example pretty simple today. So the next thing that we're going to do is actually create our first spider. In order to do that, we're going to go back to our shell. We're going to go into that project directory that we just created, and we're going to run a command called scrapy gen spider. We'll call that spider events, and we got to give it a domain. That'll be nypl.org. And once we run that, you'll see that in the spiders folder, we've got an events.py file. And in this file, Scrapy has made a spider class for our spider with all the default configuration. It has a name, has a list of domains it's allowed to look at, a list of URLs for it to start scraping, as well as a parse method. This is where all of the logic for parsing our HTML response and pulling the data out of it that we want to scrape is going to live. So the first thing that we can actually do is go to our start URLs, and we can add the URL for this page that we're on. So if I go up here and grab that, go back to our code editor and paste this into the start URLs list. You'll notice that this URL has query strings for all of the special filters that we chose, so that we can give this URL to Scrapy and get all the events that match the same criteria every time we load it. Next, we need to look at our page and figure out how we're going to get access to the data that we want. I'm going to assume you understand how HTML pages are laid out and how CSS selectors work. If that's not true, go and do some research, but we're going to assume that for the rest of this talk. In order to take a look at this page, we want to get into our web browser's developer tools. I'm in Firefox, so I can do that with Control-Shift-I. And over here on the right, my developer tool window pops open, and I can now use this to inspect any element on the page, including this table that contains all of our events. That's the table that we want to grab. So I happen to know that this table is the only table in the page that has this views table class. So that's how we'll get it. Jumping back over to our code editor, we'll go into our parse method. And I'm actually going to use some code that I've already written for the parse method. I'll paste this in and explain it as we go. So back up at the top, in order to get our table, I take our response object that is passed into our parse method, and I call the CSS method on it to query our response HTML according to a CSS selector. And in this case, that's table.viewsTable to get that table with the viewsTable class. Once I've got my table, what I really want is the events inside it. That's going to be the rows of the table. So in order to get access to that list of events, I can take our new table object that we just grabbed and call the CSS method on that. So I can grab the tbody, that's where all the rows of our data is going to live, and then I can chain another CSS method on to grab the tr table row elements for that. So now we've got our list of events, and we can loop over them and scrape the data out of them. So the way that we'll do that is in this for loop for event and events, and we're going to write a generator that's going to yield a dictionary with data points for everything that we're wanting to scrape today. What I've narrowed our data down to is the name of the event, the date and time that it's happening, the location where it's happening, and the description information that we have there in the event. So the first thing we'll grab is the name, and if I go back over to our web page, I can use my element picker to pick the name of this first film. And over here in my inspector window, we can see that that is actually a link that lives inside a div with the event name class. So in order to query for that, I can write this code. I can call the CSS method on our event row and look for an element with the event name class, and directly inside that is going to be an A tag, and we're going to select the text of that A tag since that's the name of our film. And then we don't want an object like we've been getting from our queries so far. We actually want the data out of it, and so in order to get that, we're going to use the .get method. That's our first piece of data. The next thing we want is the date and time. So back on our page, I can select the date and time over here, and what I get is a table cell with the event time class. But notice that we've got multiple lines here. So when we query for the text of this element, what it's actually going to give us is a list of nodes, all of those different lines and pieces of what's inside the element. And we don't want all the different pieces. We actually just want to stitch it all together back into one string. And so the way that we're going to do that is we're going to use an empty string and call the .join method on that string. And then the list of things that we're going to join is going to come from event.css, query for that event time class, get the text of that element. Since we're going to get a list of nodes back, we're going to use .getAll instead of .get, and that'll give us a list of nodes that we're going to join together back into one string. All right, we're halfway there. Next thing we're going to look at is the location, and looking at that, we can jump back over to our web page. If I look at the location column, that's going to live in a table cell with the event location class on it. But looking at some of these, it looks like we've got some multiple lines as well. So we're going to do the same trick that we just did. We're going to call the join method on an empty string, and we're going to pass in event.css, looking for that event location with the selecting the text. And we're going to call getAll to get all of the nodes and stitch those back together. And then the last thing that we're going to take a look at is the description. Looking back on our page, use our element picker, click on the description, and we see that that description just lives in a div with the class description. So that's going to be easy enough. Go back over to our code window, and we'll call event.css, look for the description class, select the text, and call .get. And that's everything. That's all the data that we're scraping for. We're almost ready to go. We just have one more problem. If I jump back over to my event calendar page and I scroll to the bottom, you'll see that we're actually just looking at the first page of 4 pages of results. And there's actually a way that we can tell Scrapy about our next button here, and it will actually follow that link to the next page and keep scraping until it's gotten all the results. So in order to do that, first of all, we need to take a look at this next link and see how we can query for it. So if I select it with my element picker, I see that it lives inside a nav element with the pager class, and inside of it there's an A tag with the text next and the link to the next page. So if I jump back over to my code window, I can scroll down and we'll query for the URL of that next button. In order to do that, we have to take our response object, and we're going to use the CSS method to query for that pager class, and then we get the nav. But once we've got that, there's no real easy way to get to that next link with CSS selectors. It doesn't have a class or an ID that we can grab a hold of, and we can't just query for an A tag. That would get the previous link as well on the next pages when that shows up. So in order to select this, we're going to have to use an XPath. Now, if you don't know what XPaths are, I've got a post on my blog where I go into using XPaths with Selenium, and I explain the concepts there. I'll point you to my blog in just a moment. But in the meantime, we're going to use this XPath to grab our next link. And what we're actually going to select is the href attribute of that next link so that we get the URL of the next page. And we'll call .get to grab that URL. So if .get does not find that piece of information we're querying for, if it doesn't exist, it will return the none object. So what we'll do is we'll create an if statement that says if next link is not none, if there's a URL there, then we want to scrape that page too. But first, in order to do that, we need to put together the full URL, because what we got on that next button is just a relative path that leads to the next page. We need the full path to tell Scrapy what to request, and in order to do that, we can take our response object and call the URL join method, which will take the URL of our response and it will concatenate that relative URL for the next button onto the end of it so that we get the full URL for our next page. And once we've got that, we're going to write another generator that yields a Scrapy request object for the URL of the next page, and the callback function is going to be the self.parse method that we're currently in. That's the function that we want to use to scrape that page as well. And that's everything. Are you ready? We can go ahead and run this by going to the shell and typing Scrapy crawl events, it's the name of our spider, or we can use the capital O output flag to tell Scrapy we want you to put this information in a file called events.csv. And then there we go, it's running and scraping right now, and if we look at that CSV file in something like Excel or LibreOffice, we can see the name, date and time, location, and description of all of those films. So, that brings us to the end of this talk. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this crash course on scraping the web with Python and Scrapy. If you want a link to these slides, the resources I've mentioned in this talk, as well as the repository for the code we wrote today, check out my blog at james.walters.click, where I have a post detailing all that information. Also, if you want to connect on GitHub or Mastodon, please reach out. Thanks again, everyone.